All right, it seems like when I do a video about pragmatic swordsmanship, it brings up a lot of great questions which then inspire future videos. So yes, please keep them coming. I'll do my best to keep up. But I recently did a video on pragmatic sword drawing, Iai. I skimmed over a lot of things really quickly. That was related to a video I did on different ways of carrying the katana, specifically uchi katana style, through the belt edge up. And then from those positions, how it can be deployed, employed pragmatically, practically. I wanted to devote some videos to looking at a few of those in more detail, starting with a couple that I consider potentially more problematic and also therefore less common in a lot of Iaido practice. So what are they good for? What are they maybe really not so good for? Which ones am I talking about? Katana more vertical, well, not completely vertical, but certainly more vertical than this, and the one that is more horizontal but still edge up in the draw. So let's take a closer look. All right, starting from here. In the previous videos, I talked about how the sword might be carried more often like this, and therefore you might be drawing it from this position. But why does that even make sense? If I've got my left hand on it anyway, that's really one movement. All right, two very inconvenient things that might happen that might get you to use this whether you want to or not. One of which, there might be an obstacle, which may even be a person right behind you, so when you go to reorient the sword, you can't. The other thing that's happened to me, especially if I'm wearing a gunto or something, depending on where that ashi is mounted, in uchi katana style, shoved through my belt, if I've been moving around, talked about this in my dysfunctional relationship with Sugeo, I have had scabbards start to slip down and back through the obi, so when I go to grab for it, there's not enough north of the belt to get my hand on adequately. I can barely manage to break the seal with the tsuba. So if I'm trying to draw in a hurry because I've got somebody swinging at me, yeah, this may be the best I can do. What's wrong with it? Well, you may have just kind of seen one of the biggest issues right there. Let me freeze frame. And rotate the camera matrix style. What do you see? Big hole, right? This is massively vulnerable. How can I mitigate that? Well, there's two things I could potentially do. One of which is plan to slip back out of measure as I do the draw. Now here, I'm set up to potentially do a very effective cut down upon my opponent in any orientation, any angle, and there are a number of combinations that will come off of this that are very effective potentially, but I have to get out of the way of that initial strike or I'm in trouble. It's over before I start. If there's an obstacle behind me, obviously that's not happening. The other thing I might be able to do, especially if there is an obstacle behind me, is change my body orientation to bend forward, kind of slip my abdomen back if that's what he's taking the shot at, and then be able to come down. But it's not ideal. What else might I do? Well, think about European-style swordsmanship, where the sword is worn either more vertically or at an angle, but usually edged down from a hanger. What's the first technique normally out of a draw in many HEMA styles? That would be some form of hanging guard, right? So again, depending on how I'm threatened, I might just do that. All right. Now this could potentially protect me to this side, or even more upwards, but it's not very strong. So if I'm taking something that's able to be deflected off of it, that's not too bad, but if I'm taking a hit directly into the blade, it's probably going to cave, especially with this one-handed parry, and I'm going to get hit anyway. Now, I can also mitigate this a little bit as I'm doing it by dodging offline, so the sword is just a little bit of extra protection, and I'm really trying to move my body sideways out of the way of the attack as I do it, and then from there, I can do whatever combination I intended. So it's, I would say, salvageable. What about from here? All right. I used to be a bigger fan of this because I could do certain things that were unexpected. Would also count for some of these draws. What am I talking about? I have to do it slow if I can do it at all. I used to be very good at being able to draw edge up and do a quick dropping wrist cut that would spin into any of a number of other techniques. Now, with my injury, let's talk about that for a second. Both of these orientations, here and here, have become less appealing, and you may have noticed this in the previous video I did on Pragmatic Iai. It's also one of the reasons why I don't start a draw this way, only to turn it this way in the middle of the draw. I talked about binding. Well, it's gotten worse with this. This wrist doesn't bend very much anymore. So being able to get a good grip on a sword in the edge up orientation. It's a little bit better here, which would make me favor this over this. I really can't get a good grip on the sword this way. I have to turn it sideways or upside down. And we'll talk about those in other videos. So yeah, this is kind of a closed chapter for me. But I used to be really good at drawing into downward cuts, thrusts, reverse thrusts, and we'll devote a separate video actually entirely to striking with the pommel. But yeah, being able to draw effectively like this is just, it is very problematic. And you know, what can you do with it? I demonstrated in the other video that yes, I can bring it into any of a number of parries very quickly, but again, they're one-handed parries. Probably have to enhance those by dodging, slipping, and then very quickly get my other hand on the blade. I can bring it into, again, a lot of middle positions where I could potentially thrust, and yeah, there's a potential for a quick downward slash. Otherwise, yeah, I think I've lost my romance for this particular draw position. If I'm going to go ahead and grab the sword and orient it this way, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and twist it before I draw. With my limited range of motion, a couple of doors have been closed. Now, one thing that came up in the questions, kind of related to things that happen with the carry of handguns. Are you carrying and drawing your handgun in a way that you are potentially pointing the weapon at yourself? And sometimes in the draws here, and this also came up in the one I did that was the Saya peel, is this weapon pointed edge at me at any time? Well, let's go back a step to sword horizontal. Kind of looks like it for maybe a split second, but the way I twist my body and the sword, if I move the weapon in the direction of the edge, you'll notice it does pass by the side of my head by a couple of inches. Same thing with any of the edge up draws. Does kind of look like the edge is pointing at me. That could be potentially dangerous. But here it's even more reduced, where pretty much as soon as the thing is cleared, it's not really pointed at me anymore. Again, I'm restricted in terms of the paths the sword can take coming out of something like that, but it's not so dangerous. For instance, this path is really no different from when I do a rolling cut. Pretty much the same, almost the same clearance. So I'm not as worried about the edge and or tip facing into me, which could be catastrophic if the enemy suddenly collides with me where, yeah, I'm pointing my own sword at myself. That would be really, really bad. So I have taken steps with practice just to prevent that from happening. One of the other things, though, about these two orientations is I find they prevent one particular common kind of accident for the Iai practitioner. And that would be a little overzealousness or lack of experience going from draw to cut. What am I talking about? These two orientations, the draw tends to be pretty straight out of the scabbard and then transitions clearly into the next technique. Let me show it to you from this one. Little bit less so. Again, when I got overzealous maybe with that downward cut, I might jump the gun a little bit. What am I talking about? Happens a lot from going from edge horizontal into that cut. You really need to separate the forward action from the cutting action. You got to maintain your momentum and your chainy. You got to keep it smooth. But for a beginner, I really will first recommend not necessarily doing it with a sharp sword until you get comfortable with it, but really transitioning, making clear transitions in your steps from here to here. Okay? Because if you don't, I've seen this happen, well, once is too many times. The person will start to torque on the sword as it's coming out of the scabbard. Split the edge straight through the top of the saya and into their own hand. Yeah. Even if you miss your hand, you've destroyed your saya. But yeah, your hand is right tender meat in the way of razor blade. Really catastrophic, potentially, when it happens. So that's one of the biggest risks about learning Iaido with a live sword, is not taking the time to master this part. And then slowly but surely take your time to chain it into that part, okay? So you're not jumping the gun. This is also going to change anytime you pick up a new sword that's got a different length and a different curve, and we'll get into that in other videos. How do sword lengths and curvatures affect anything I'm going to show you? But until then, draw from a more vertical position, draw from the horizontal-ish position, edge up. Benefits, drawbacks. Do you guys use either one of these? Have you had experience with either one of these? Let's talk about it in the comments, things you like about it, don't like about it. Any of your particular teachers have warned you away from doing stuff like this. Again, I did display it in the peel technique, and yeah, again, it's not really pointing at me, but we talked in the previous video about, how that's kind of messes up the chaining of my momentum when I do it. All right, was this useful, approachable? Let me know in the comments. Thanks you guys for watching, and I hope to see you back for more.